Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. I'm Matt Preem, Eric Scopel on the show as always, and today we're bringing in our good friend, National College Football Reporter Brandon Marcello for 247Sports. Brandon, how's it going? Football is here. We've got games. We're talking about games.
Yeah.
What's up, man?
I'm doing very well. I'm as you're talking to me now, I'm realizing I haven't packed because I got to go from one end of the country to the other end of the country to cover 2 games this weekend, and I am super pumped.
So I need to know, before we dive into our real questions, you've got some stats behind your head. 193, 38, 55 yards, 1 touchdown for William. What are these? What are these stats here?
Yeah. Well, that's DJ Uyunglele,
okay,
who put up 193 yards, but not a win, and
yep.
didn't throw beyond the line of scrimmage very often for Florida State. I love this thing. It's just is it paused? Is it frozen? I think it's frozen. It's supposed to cycle through scores and everything. That's not
okay.
Good.
Yeah, it's been stuck on those guys, but I was curious if there was like a tie to those 3 names.
No,
specifically.
Nope, sadly no.
All right, well, let's get to the real stuff when we had you on the show. It's a new era of college football this season. A new 12-team playoff, the start of super conferences being formed. What's your thoughts on the path for national success? Is it easier for the non-Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, LSU teams that have basically kind of won the national championship the last decade or so, or has it gotten tougher?
I think it's easier. Because I'll point out like a couple teams, like Penn State. The knock on James Franklin's always been can't get to the playoff or whatever. But if we had the 12-team playoff going on the last 10 years, they would have been in the playoff 6 times in the last 10 years. Now, would they have done anything there? I mean, that's who knows, but they would have been in. And I think the perception of James Franklin would be much different. Much different. In fact, they would have been one of the top, I think, 7 teams with the most playoff appearances.
Wow.
So would they have won a national championship? Probably not. But again, you're in the hunt. You are in that fold. And who's to say that Penn State can have parlayed playoff appearances into better recruiting? And who knows what would have happened there. Now, when we talk about Group of 5 programs, I think it's a wash. It's going to be the same pretty much. You're going to have 1 Group of 5 team in there, maybe 2 at most in some years. And when that happens, they're going to get some bad matchups, and they're going to be on the road in the first playoff game. And you know that those crowds are going to be nuts.
Yeah.
But this opens the door for those teams that finish in the middle pack of the power conferences to potentially get to a playoff like once every 3 or 4 years, which I'm going to tell you, that should make half of college football happy.
Yes.
Really, if you think about it. But if you're a coach at a program, and let's say you stay there longer than 5 years, in years 6, 7, 8, one of those 3 years, you better make a playoff. Otherwise, they're probably going to fire you at that point. So I think, again, this is me just speaking hypothetically because we haven't seen it yet, but that's, I think, how we'll see things kind of change when we talk about head coaches in this space and their contracts and how long they live out there with their jobs.
Brendan, I kind of wanted to pivot to the Big Ten for a moment here in Oregon and Ohio State. And it's interesting because I think when we had you on right when this merger, kind of a merger, when the Oregon and Washington were joining USC and UCLA going to the Big Ten, it was kind of hard to pinpoint where Oregon fit exactly in terms of the hierarchy of the conference. And a lot has changed. Michigan's won a national championship. Washington just played for one. And yet Oregon and Ohio State have kind of this year sort of, I think, kind of separated a little bit, at least in terms of what the perception is entering the season. Yeah. I guess, A, does that surprise you? And B, does that feel sustainable? Like, are we looking at a Big Ten landscape over the next 5 years where these are the 2 heavy hitters most years in your mind?
Maybe, but I think like that second through fourth spot will probably interchange a lot, in fact, the first through 4 will interchange a lot in those years. Oregon will certainly, I think, be in that top 4 every single year simply because of the recruiting. that's been going on there the last 3 years, especially lately, what they've done in hitting in the transfer portal. I mean, I always go back to just this simple stat of how often do you replace a 15,000-yard passer in Bo Nix with another 15,000-yard passer? Never, ever in college football. This is the first time it's happened. So they're just killing it at Oregon right now, and they're set up for success. And I not equate it, but the program that I think you could be most comparable to this, and Oregon fans will probably hate hearing this, is Miami, because Miami has built its program finally to strike this year because of the portal, but also through high school recruiting. They've done pretty well in high school recruiting at Miami under Mario Cristobal. And much like at Oregon, he's built it from the inside out, in the trenches on out. He hasn't been able to quite hit on a quarterback, but he may have with Cam Ward, because you guys saw him up close to Washington State. They are deep across the trenches. And then Oregon, you know, a lot of people compare them to Georgia, but I do think it's apt in just the amount of depth they've built in the trenches. This team, out of any team moving in to the Big Ten this year, is more than capable of playing any style of football, but also in particular, quote unquote, Big Ten football. When you're going to be dealt with some injuries, and in November, you're going to go against a team that isn't necessarily an Ohio State like you will in October, but you're going to be tested because there's going to be one or two matchups that you just aren't quite what you thought you were going to be because of injuries, or someone slowed down by an injury that's still in the game. That just happens in the Big Ten every single year. I'm not so sure that happens week to week in the Pac-12 as it has in the past. I just hate to say that, but it's just the way it is. So Oregon's more than capable of being in that top four every single year. And this year, to me, they're in the top two, like everybody will say. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but I think Oregon's going to win the Big Ten this year. They're going to piss off every single gray-haired fan in the Big Ten who's just accustomed to seeing Ohio State or Michigan. And then you got Penn State out there in the top 10 who's thinking, this is finally the year we're going to break through. We got Andy Kotelnicki calling the offense with that creative mind he had at Kansas. Drew Aller is finally going to break through and all this. I'm telling you, the team that's going to break through and break people down is probably Oregon. They've been building up to this moment, and you know, before they knew they were going into the Big Ten, but they are very much equipped because Dan Lanning was building a quote unquote SEC type of team through the recruiting, and that translates to the Big Ten.
I think this kind of segues right into my next question of their preseason top three team in the country. It's the highest it's been going into the year since 2014. Historically, they've been a top 15 team the last decade or so. Yet, from my experience growing up in Eugene and then going through high school, graduating college, and coming through here now in this job, and Eric's is probably the same, there's still a little sense of like, is this really a team that's a top three team in the country? They've never won a national championship. They've played for it a couple times, but they've never actually gotten to the top of the mountain. Like, now we throw in the 12-team playoff, and you throw in the highest ranking in a decade going into a season. And it's like, on one hand, you want to say like, hey, if they don't make the semifinals, it's a disappointment. But on the other hand, you look at the history of the program and where it's been, it's kind of like that should still be celebrated as a success. From an outsider's perspective, how do we judge this? Like, what's the pressure that Oregon faces this season?
Well, if they make the semifinals this year, I think it's an unquestioned success. Yes. No matter even what happens in the Big Ten. I hate to say it, but conference championships they're degraded a little bit by this new system. It just is. I mean, you know, I wrote a story about this, or a column more or less, about Ohio State, where Ryan Day, you know, he's only lost to two current Big Ten members. That's Oregon a couple of years ago, even though they weren't in the Big Ten yet, and of course Michigan. And yet everybody's like, is he on the hot seat because he can't win a national championship and all this? And there's legitimate chatter about that, guys, even among administrators there, because it's like, okay, so you haven't made the playoff, but expectations are reset this year because of this expanded playoff. And as Ross Bjork, the AD, told me just a month ago in this column I wrote, is that, okay, say we lose to Michigan again for a fourth straight time, and we miss the Big Ten championship, and say Michigan wins the Big Ten championship, but we make the playoff. and we make it to the national championship game, and Michigan loses in the semis.
Who had a better year?
Who had the better year?
Yeah.
Everything's got to be weighed differently as a result. This changes things dramatically. And then, you know, you look at Ohio State and just how close they've been. I mean, you know, hindsight and everything, and it didn't happen. But 2 years ago, they hit that field goal against Georgia. They're going to win the national championship 10 days later against TCU. And that looks a lot different at this point because Michigan lost their semifinal game. So did Ohio State. But if Ohio State pulled that off, they would have won the national title the next week. And what kind of dynamic are we looking at? But that's kind of football, college football nowadays. It's turning more and more into the NFL to the point where it's just everything's going to come down to like one or two plays in these games to contend whether your season was a success or a failure. But there's a little bit more leeway now because finally we have that expanded playoff.
I have another question in a second, Matt, but I want to follow up. Do you think it's for what you just said there? I find really compelling. Do you think that's for the better, that our focus is just on that last kind of stretch of the season? Or because I growing up, it was, I know Josh Pate has waxed poetically on this many times about the bowl season and the regular season and how it's being diminished through this. Like, what's your stance on what this is doing for the sport? Because this is obviously where we're headed. Like, what's your feeling on it?
Bowl season's been diminished the last 10, 12 years anyway. I don't get excited anymore as I did. And I sometimes wonder if it's just because I'm getting older. And when I was younger, it was like, oh, man, I can't wait to, you know, stay home and watch this game on December 17th, you know, in a lower tier bowl. But I do think it's because it's just, you know, ESPN. Half the teams aren't playing, but ESPN and some of the media, and I'm guilty of it too, we focus so much on the 4 teams that are in the playoff, and they're talking that up throughout December. Like, they're live games, which, by the way, ESPN owns most of the bowl games, these lower tier bowl games, and they broadcast them. And if you watch those games, like, it's like an infomercial for the playoff. They're just talking about, oh, good, tune in 2.5 weeks for, like, I don't give a crap. Talk about these 2 teams. But I think it kind of, it fades even the current game you're watching into the background. It's almost like it's background noise, and they're talking up some other things. And I'm guilty of it. I think we all become guilty of it. That will still be the case, but at least now we'll be talking about 12 teams. And then also in November, we're going to be talking about 30 teams that have a possibility to get into the playoff, more so than the 8 teams or 9 teams, because you know, every time we had those playoff rankings being released, you know, in November is always like no team that ranked lower than 9th in this set of rankings has ever made the playoffs. So you automatically like cut off anybody who's ranked at this point in these playoff rankings in November. That won't necessarily be the case, at least in this first year. And then for that matter, I think the sport will be more exciting than ever for these at least the next 3 to 4 years, because we're probably going to expand it again here to 16 or maybe even 14 in the next couple of years. And that's going to change things a little bit more as well.
I guess we'll stay kind of macro focused and look at the Heisman race and talk about Dylan Gabriel's candidacy. And I'm curious on what your perspective is. I don't know if we've talked or had you on the podcast since he's joined Oregon, but this is a guy who was obviously very successful. You already referenced the statistical milestones, the records he's going to be able to potentially set. But I think at times last year, he was like, after the game with Texas, he was seen as like a Heisman candidate, but that kind of faded. Does it surprise you, I guess, A, that he enters the season right at the top there? And then B, how much of that do you think is the Oregon offense and kind of what's around him maybe lifting up his candidacy? Because the expectation is, hey, Bo Nix just had this incredible statistical season, insert quarterback, whatever, and he should be able to kind of manufacture similar results.
I think there's some of that, but I also think he's helped quite a bit by there's just really not like a otherworldly, incredible quarterback out there nationally. There's some really great ones we talked up. Quinn Ewers, for example. A lot of us are high on Will Howard, but it's also like he just went to Ohio State and to Kansas State. He was great, but what exactly is he going to look like in that offense? Ohio State, Cam Ward going to Miami, where everybody's like, you know, Miami, you know, the coaching there in late game situations hasn't been great. He's going to be in a position to do that, and they haven't won anything at Miami in so long. And then even with Quinn Ewers at Texas, there's still chatter in the background about Arch Manning.
Yeah.
Whereas with Dylan Gabriel, and we've seen this with veteran quarterbacks in the portal era, that they're like good bets. You know, you go in, they're pretty much successful, and they move on. And I think a lot of people will look at the mold and the trajectory of a Dylan Gabriel or a Cam Rising, for example, where they may not, quote unquote, be great NFL quarterbacks or high picks in the draft, but boy, can you make a living in college by floating around for 4 to 5 years, but also veteran leadership and veteran experience is so paramount to a team's success now in this playoff era, in the portal era. So I think he gets a lot of those, almost like he checks these boxes, right? And having said that, you know, I might be mistaken here, but like, when's the first time like the preseason favorite for the Heisman ended up winning it? And there's gonna be a lot of shakeup this year, and there's that sensibility now that we got to pick someone to be in the race that's not necessarily a quarterback anymore. Let's put a receiver in there. I mean, even Marvin Harrison Jr. and all that stuff, and of course in the past with Alabama. So there's going to be some guy, like especially the first 3 weeks of the season. You guys know this. Those first 3 games, we're going to overreact about someone or something, and we're obviously going to overreact about teams, but we're going to overreact about a couple of players and put them in the Heisman race. I mean, I always remember Texas A&M going to South Carolina in their season opener on a Thursday, the year after Johnny Manziel left, right? And Kenny Trill goes off against Carolina, and we're all like, man, A&M's not going to miss a beat. He's going to be the Heisman winner. And then he just absolutely crapped the bed after that. So, but that's why I love this sport more than any other, because it's wild. We don't know what to really expect. Someone always kind of rises to the occasion and then floats back down. But yeah, long way to say, you know, Dylan Gabriel checks a lot of boxes. You know, he's one of a few quarterbacks out there I would say is a quote unquote gamer. Like, he just takes over a team, puts them on his shoulders when he needs to. We saw it at Oklahoma previously, saw it at UCF. You know, he's the type of quarterback. I remember Gus Malzahn telling me that, I guess it was 2 years ago now, that if he had stayed at UCF, he's like, I think we could have won undefeated in the AAC because he was just that good.
Wow. Dan Lanning's profile, speaking of high-profile names, has just been on like a rocket and just to the moon. Are you at all surprised that, from a national scope, how far he's climbed up the ranks? Like, the Big Ten doesn't put out a preseason award list, and I think it was Cleveland.com that did it. They pulled a bunch of reporters, and he was named like preseason Big Ten Coach of the Year over Ryan Day. Is this at all surprising? He's never won a league title yet. And I'm not trying to like break Dan down, but I'm trying to take the other approach of like, hey, he's lost his 2 rivals, Washington and Oregon. He's lost to Washington twice in a season. If they played Washington last year in the playoffs, if they somehow got in, they were going to lose again for a 3rd time probably. He doesn't have a league title, and yet he's being perceived as one of, if not like the hottest young coach in college football, or maybe just one of the overall best coaches in general, which I'm not disagreeing with, but it's just kind of crazy where his profile has gone from just 3 years ago.
Yeah, young and fresh and on the scene, that helps. Yeah. You know, Ryan Day, who's only been a head coach for 4 or 5 years, the problem with him, perception wise, is one, as you mentioned, not winning championship, really, a national championship, as we mentioned earlier. But also he followed Urban Meyer, which had won a national championship. So if Dan Lanning had just left and replaced someone that had won Oregon's first national title and he was doing this, it'd be like, yeah, he's a pretty good coach. He's a pretty good coach, but we need to see him actually win a championship here. We need to get to the league championship game and win it now. And he hasn't done that. And now he's going to the Big Ten. So we got our questions about it. Even though he keeps recruiting, I think it's funny. I think the stink on Dan Lanning, if he was, say, Ryan Day doing what he's doing now, but at Ohio State, it would be, hey, he's just a recruiter. He's just a recruiting coach. He's not a good coach. He's not a good defensive mind, but he is a great defensive mind.
Very, very, very good.
But the problem is just the perception of things based off of the past, and then we're trying to judge everybody off the past, whereas instead of judging a lot of these coaches based on a vacuum, and for that matter, good luck to Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, elite coach and all that, but crap. If he only wins 9 games this year and barely misses a playoff, they're going to be like, well, God, he's so terrible, worst coach ever. It's like, no, not by any stretch of the imagination. He's probably one of the top 4 or 5 coaches in all of the sport, and you're going to think he's bad just because he won 9 games in his first year, replacing the greatest coach of all time.
Fickle beast. You know, I don't know if we'll get you on before October 12th, so I just kind of want to ask you what piques your interest in an Oregon-Ohio State matchup, like whether it be a position group or a matchup on the field, whether it be the tactical stuff with the coaching staffs, whatever. What's on your when you talk about that game? What jumps out?
Well, one, I'm not even talking about matchups, just Ohio State and Autzen. That's huge. Secondly, how about Ohio State's secondary, which is elite against Dylan Gabriel and those receivers and being able to stretch the ball downfield? That's huge. That's gigantic in that game. And something really to watch because, Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator at Ohio State, he's gotten his flowers, but this guy, like everywhere he goes, just like develops defenses. And by year 2 and year 3, they're like top 10 all of a sudden. He did it at Oklahoma State and did it with a roster that turned over a lot of guys. And then he brought in some others and then built that thing up. And they got hired away by Ohio State, which was abysmal, if you guys remember, just 3 years ago in a lot of games. I mean, Oregon ran over their ass. They could not stop Oregon in the trenches. And Jim Knowles has had to come in there and not necessarily like restock the cupboard because they've got talent, but he had to figure things out scheme-wise, getting those guys' confidence back, and then saying, these are the pillars of my defense and what we're going to do at linebacker and in the secondary. I know we can get big bodies in the trenches, but we need to fix these things on the back end. And, here early, in late August, before Ohio State or Oregon play a game, I'm intrigued by that. Gabriel and those receivers against that secondary of Ohio State.
Last one for me in the show is just kind of what excites you just about Oregon this season. Maybe it's like an unknown. Like what's the intrigue here for you from your 30,000 feet in the air vantage point of college football?
The schedule for them, I think, is conducive to make a run in the Big Ten championship game. It's huge, obviously, just getting Ohio State at home. But also, I think that Oregon's a type of team and program, and Dan Lanning, the way he is and talks to his team in the locker room, where they're going into the Big Ten, like, let's just, like I mentioned earlier, let's piss everybody off. Let's upset the apple cart here. Let's do something that no one, I want to say no one's really expecting, but some of the top dogs in the Big Ten are going to be like, yeah, whatever. They might be good, but they're not
that good.
Let's go show them a little something. And that gives that roster a little bit extra motivation for a team that's already deep and experienced. And to me, again, like my power rankings right now going into the season are based pretty much just what's on paper. So I've got Ohio State 1 and I've got Oregon, I think 3 right now. But my prediction is Oregon to win the Big Ten championship game and to beat Ohio. And it's because of the schedule and beating Ohio State at home. And I think Ohio State may very well slip up one other time in their schedule this season. So Oregon's got the offensive weapons. They've got the defense. The one thing that worries me, guys, about Oregon, and you guys can probably fill me in better on this here or off the air, is what's going on at center. Can they get the ball to the quarterback, or are we going to have another Alabama problem like last season? There's a few teams out there, guys, that I think it would surprise you that are having center quarterback exchange issues right now going into week 1. And these are top 15 programs. And it's just like, why the hell is that a problem right now? Why is that still a thing? And I know at Oregon, that's been an issue since the spring, right? So
a little bit.
It's but here's the thing, does 1 or 2 bad snaps a game lose you a game? If it's a big enough game and tight, yeah. It lost Alabama the game against Michigan in the semifinal last year in the Rose Bowl. So who knows?
I guess to fill you in and our listeners, we think a walk-on is going to be the starting center. Which
now, it's not a typical walk-on.
Right.
It's a guy that had Group of 5 Oregon State offers. He chose to walk on at Oregon, a top 10 player in the state of Oregon when he was coming out of the class. And typically the state produces about 7 to 10 D1 FBS Power 5 level guys every year. So it's a guy that it's not an Oregon caliber recruit coming out of high school, but it's also a guy that had legit offers to other schools.
And I'll also just say to wrap that, we have no idea until we get to Saturday.
Yes.
Dan, you probably saw it. Dan was asked who the starting center was going to be, and he basically told us to kick rocks. So we'll see what happens on Saturday, and it's possible one of 3 different things happens, and we're all just waiting.
Hey, it's no different at any other program. Like Maryland has been cloak and dagger about who's going to be their quarterback, and for really no reason. I mean, there's been programs where it's like, we know this guy's a starter, but they're like, well, we don't know. It's like, no, oh, come on now. But that's college football.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting season. It's going to be a fun season. Hopefully, towards the end of it, we'll get you on again to talk big picture stuff. Brandon, thanks a lot for coming on. Look forward to having you on again down the road.
All right. See you guys.